has served as the unit leader of the Groundwater Resources Division and currently serves as the executive administrator for water science and conservation. He has 64 scientists and engineers and specialists in his shop. Their goal is to better understand surface and groundwater resources in Texas and advocating water conservation and innovation in water technologies such as desalination, aquifer storage and recovery, reuse, and rainwater harvesting. Prior to joining the Texas Water Development Board, and where I got to know Robert first, he worked for 9 years at the Bureau of Economic Geology at UT in Austin. He was a hydrologist and a research scientist. Robert has a BS in geophysics and an MS in hydrology from New Mexico State Institute of Mining and Technology and a PhD in hydrology from the University of Texas at Austin. His residential consumption of water is less than 30 gallons per person per day. So he practices what he preaches, and he said he'd even do better if his wife would cooperate more. So join me in welcoming Robert Mace.
As you look about your tabletop, you probably see some humdrum things, some plastic bowls, forks, maybe your phone is sitting out there, you've got a cup, maybe you've got an iPad. All those things have a fascinating backstory. Paperclip, there's a dude who wrote a book about the history of the paperclip. It's quite fascinating. You wouldn't think there'd be a fascinating story behind a paperclip. Well, the case is also true for windmills. And so what I'm going to share with you today is a history of how the windmills that you see here in the High Plains, across Texas, or wherever in the country, how they came about. And it's a fascinating story. It's a story of human ingenuity, also a story of American ingenuity, because Americans put quite a stamp on the history of windmills. And then also, to a certain degree, a story of Texas ingenuity as well. We've also been important in the history of windmills. The photo on this cover slide here makes me wish I was lived a long time ago, perhaps. This is from the 1893 World Columbian exhibit in Chicago. And this was arguably the peak of windmill manufacturing in the country. There were dozens and dozens of companies around the Chicago, Illinois area that were pitching various flavors of windmills to farmers and to railroads across the country as well as across the world. Now, obviously, I love windmills. This isn't going to work. So obviously, I love windmills. Hopefully I'll be able to show you some cool pictures. How I got interested in windmills was I went probably 10 some years ago on a geologic field trip tour in Austin out to the hill country that was focused on wine and tying geology to wine. And it was a great tour because you hopped on a bus and you drank all day, learned a little bit about rocks. But the next day I was thinking about that tour going, well, you don't really associate geologists and wine. In my mind, you associate geologists with beer and barbecue. And so I became inspired that I was going to put together a field trip tied to barbecue. And so then the thought was, okay, how do I connect brisket to geology and water? Well, the first thought that popped in my head was windmills. And I'm like, okay, I can just do a little bit of research on windmills and put together a story on how this is tied into both the hydrogeology, the aquifers, as well as to the history of how windmills were created. And pretty much it all ended there. I started picking up some books, reading about windmills, got completely absorbed in it, and could not stop reading about windmills. Never did the field trip. Maybe when I retire, I have more time, I'll be able to do that. And so I'm going to share with you is what I've learned. Now, as an acknowledgement, there's a fellow by the name of T. Lindsay Baker. How many of y'all heard of T. Lindsay Baker? He has written some fabulous books about American windmills, and I'll explain to you in a bit what American windmills are, as well as some great picture books about, oh yeah, see, there I am. I love windmills. That's a picture of me at the Wind Power Museum in Lubbock, one of the, my opinion, 7 wonders of the world. That is a fantastic place. You should check it out. And then there's T. Lindsay Baker. About half of the information I'm presenting to you today comes from books that T. Lindsay Baker has written. So here's an outline of my presentation. I'll go into the first mention of windmills up through the very earliest windmills, what's called the European windmills, and then end with a discussion on the American windmills. So early windmill history goes back to about 60 AD, Hero of Alexandria. And he wrote a book called Pneumatica, which basically means using air to do things. And in that book, he has this diagram of a wind-powered, with a windmill, wind-powered pneumatic organ. Unclear if this was ever built. This is just something he speculated about, but this is the earliest evidence of somebody having like kind of a windmill head and using it for something, to do something. I don't know what this sounded like. It probably sounded like as the wind came by, or if it was a real windy day, but probably would have been a cool thing. Now, the first evidence of a real windmill being built actually goes back to Persia, sometime between 650 and 950. Early references to it go back to 650. And it's something called a panamony. And so there's a graphic there that shows you it. It's a vertical axis. There's paddles. It kind of looks like a riverboat paddle, but turned up on its side. And you'll see in brown some walls around it. And so what the Persians did was they would build a wall such that only one side of the paddles would be exposed to the wind. The wind would blow, and it would then turn that paddle around. And windmill comes from, the mill part of windmill comes from the fact that the early windmills a lot of times were used for milling grain. And that was true for these panamonies back in Persia. However, there's also written evidence that these were used to pull water out of wells to water gardens and crops as well back in Persia. Here's an example of one of these, a photograph of one in Pakistan. So again, you can see the brickwork, you can see the kind of reed-based panels in there, and they would capture the wind. Now obviously, you couldn't turn this thing any direction, so they built it one direction where the prevailing winds were coming, and in this case, this one was used for milling grain. It's kind of a big leap in terms of from those panamonies to European windmills, and there's a gap in history in terms of where the kind of the classic tilting at windmills came from in Europe. They just suddenly start to appear. The first references in Europe showing up in about 1100. And the reason these windmills popped up was that there was a growing population. There were mills along the rivers to mill grain, and most, if not all, of those sites were taken up. And with the growing population, those river mills were making money hand over fist, to the point where some smart individual said, heck, I could capture the wind and mill grain with the wind. And in fact, the earliest mention of European windmills came from lawsuits from the river operators against the wind operators, because the river operators felt that they were competing for their business and tried to stop them from building windmills to mill grain. And they failed in that effort. Similar to the panamonies I showed you, they were solid windmills, and they've pointed in one direction. And so they just made sure you pointed it in the right direction. As long as the wind was coming at you, you were fine. If the wind started coming from the side, you're kind of, you couldn't run your windmill that day. So that got people thinking about, well, how do we get the windmill to face the wind? And someone developed what are called post windmills. And what a post windmill means is you can kind of see it in the guts of that diagram there. There's a big post that the entire body of the windmill was on, such that the entire body, you could turn it. You'd get some graduate students or your kids kind of push on that thing and turn it so you could always be into the wind and be most efficient in capturing the wind to pump water or to mill your grain. On the right-hand side, you can see two examples of those mills, or those post-type windmills, where they've got some infrastructure or building around the base of it there. Then, about 1295 in France, someone came up with the idea about, well, I can just build a base and just have the top turn. And so these are called tower windmills. So in this diagram here, you can see a big stick, big hunk of lumber coming off the top of that windmill, off to the left, down to the bottom. And this, again, someone could get out and push and pull the top of that windmill to get it into the wind. Or if it was too windy, maybe push it out of the wind a little bit so the wind wouldn't tear the windmill apart. Had to adjust by hand. You could also adjust the revolutions per minute on these windmills by adjusting the sails. So if you look at the blades there, they look like ladders. They actually put sails, like from sailboats, in those. And so in that particular example, you can see two of the blades have sails in them. So it was probably a windy day that day, and they didn't want to capture all the wind and have it turn too fast. But as you can see, pretty intensive to manually adjust the direction. And if you needed to adjust the revolutions per minute, you'd have to stop the whole thing, get somebody who wasn't afraid of heights to get up there and change those sails out, or maybe add sails or take sails off. So here's some example of these tower mills. This is a photograph from Spain. And if you look closely, you can see some big hunks of lumber sticking off the back there where they could rotate the tops to turn those windmills either into or out of the wind. This is a map I put together that shows first mentions of windmills in Europe. And one thing I learned, I've read a lot of books about these windmills, and if you read a book from Spain, they will claim to have invented the windmill. If you read a book from France, they will tell you they invented the windmill. England will tell you they invented the windmill. Norway, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody takes claim for it. Based on my research, the earliest date I felt that was believable was in England, but who knows? It's just all of a sudden there's a reference to a windmill due to a lawsuit. The other interesting thing is that the Catholic Church collected essentially taxes or fees from mills along the rivers. And once these windmills came up, the Vatican saw that as a threat, and so demanded that they cannot be built without the church's consent, and they have to add a papal tithe for their operation. And so once that all got worked out, then you had a massive explosion of windmills across Europe. So here's a photo, or a diagram rather, of a tower windmill, and it's actually showing it pumping water or pulling water out of an aquifer. And again, very manually intensive. Had to get up and change the sails, and then if the wind direction changed, you'd have to get someone out there to untie it, push it around, and tie it down again. And so people started thinking about, well, how do we automate this regulation of revolutions per minute? How do we optimize the efficiency of capturing the wind? And so in 1745, a fellow by the name of Edmund Lee came up with something called a fantail. And the fantail is that little tail you see in the back end there that also has, it looks like a little windmill. And what he did was he invented this fantail such that if the wind direction changed, the windmill would adjust itself to optimize its position with respect to the wind, capture the wind, and more efficiently do whatever it was doing, pumping water or milling grain. They called it the self-regulating machine. And here's a picture of one of those. The fantail here is up on the top of this tower windmill. And so you no longer see that big chunk of lumber sticking off the back. Now this thing could adjust itself to go into the wind. This is an example from Denmark. The other thing was the sails. And in fact, in windmill lingo, it's still called the sails, the sails that went into the arms of the windmill face. And in fact, even with windmills today, the metal windmills today, they refer to the blades as the sails. And so this is also a very manual-intensive exercise of getting somebody to kind of ladder up there, crawl up the ladder, and unfurl the sails to capture the wind. Or perhaps if it was a very windy day, maybe restrict the size of those sails. And so a lot of thought was put into, well, how do we control that automatically? And someone came up with the flaps that would go onto those windmill arms, such that they had springs on them, so if it was real blowy, the flaps would actually bend more and let the wind pass through. Never really caught on, however. So then we got to leap forward to what we call American windmills in terms of the next big advance in windmill technology. Now, the first windmills in the United States were post-type European-style windmills. And the first one appears to have been built in the Flower Dew 100 plantation near Jamestown, Virginia in 1621. That's an old map of Virginia there from about that time, and then there's a photo you see that it's a reproduction of that windmill. Funny story, I was, probably 5 years ago, I was out helping the state of Virginia with some groundwater modeling, groundwater management type questions, and hung out for an extra day so I could go down and see this windmill. And it was probably a 2-hour drive out of Richmond. And took a little bit of searching around. I finally found where I needed to go, and the gate was locked. I was just thinking, well, this stinks. And there's a little note on the gate, and it says, "Windmill has been moved to Lubbock." No joke. They packed it up and shipped it to the Wind Power Museum in Lubbock. So I got a good chuckle out of that. I was disappointed, but I thought that was just perfect that that's where that windmill wound up. Here's a neat old painting I found of New Amsterdam. And if you look in the distance, you can see a post windmill there. Does anybody know where New Amsterdam is today? It's New York. It got changed. This is a show of it in 1664, and that same year, the name changed from New Amsterdam to New York. But you can see one in the distance there. There was also hundreds more of these windmills were built across the particularly the eastern United States. But the big leap forward in windmill technology happened in 1854. There was a fellow by the name of John Berman in the 1840s that had a pump company and in Connecticut, and he had the idea of building a smaller size, like residential size, self-regulating windmill. A windmill that would put itself into the wind as well as control how fast it went. Because you didn't want your windmill catching the wind so efficiently during super windy days that it would just tear everything up. And so this is the holy grail at that time of windmill technology. And so Mr. Burnham approached Dan Halliday about 1854 to design such a windmill. And Dan Halliday was, at that time, that's a picture of him there. Much later, he was probably about 25 years old when he was approached. In very short order, he invented the first true self-regulating windmill in the world. And it was the beginning of what's termed American windmills. Now, the way his invention worked was, and this is actually a diagram from his patent, is that you can see you've got the vane in the back that obviously puts the windmill into the right direction into the wind. And then he's got these windmill arms in the front. And the faster it turned, those arms would start turning out of the wind to spill the wind. So that way it kept the speed pretty consistent. And then if the wind eased off, it would then put the flaps more into the wind to capture it more efficiently. So it automatically did that based on how fast the windmill head was spinning. And this turned out to be a great success. And patented it, wound up forming the Halliday Windmill Company along with Mr. Burnham. However, the sales were disappointing in the East. Couldn't really get people to buy these things. However, with the Homestead Law and the migration of Americans to the West, there was great interest in having kind of your own source of power for pumping water, for milling grain, for running your tools, even electricity, because we think that these power generating windmills are a new thing. That technology has been around for over 100 years. And so the sales in the western United States were through the roof. Railroads needed water as the railroads were expanding, and so more and more windmills started selling out in the West. Mr. Burnham decided he would go ahead and move out west to Chicago and actually opened up his own company called the U.S. Wind Engine and Pump Company. And he was still focused on pumps, and he was selling the Halliday standard windmills as well. He did so well, having moved out to Chicago and selling windmills to Westerners, that in 1863 he bought the Halliday Windmill Company and then moved just south of Chicago in Batavia, Illinois. And then started tweaking and working on the design. And I'm sure many of you, if you're fans of windmills or gone around, you've seen windmills like this. And this was a Halliday standard windmill. So rather than having the blades of the windmill turn like this, let's see, this is going to look like interpretive dance, but rather than having the blades turn like this, and I'm going to look like a chicken. What it did was it had these panels of these little wooden slats that the faster the wind blew, the panels would start kind of coming out to spill the wind. And so when you saw it full on, that meant it really wasn't a terribly windy day. But as you saw those slats starting to kind of start to spread out, then you knew it was a windy day. Or if they were completely spread out, the windmill was off. It was spilling all of the wind. And you can even see here the terminology, in sail, out of sail, from the original catalog of this Halliday standard windmill. So this became the cool way to design windmills, and there were many of these across the country. This is a little diagram from the Wind Power Museum I took a photo of, and you just see on your far left, that's when it's capturing all the wind, and then as it gets windier, in other words, the blades start spinning faster, automatically they start kind of bending in and spilling the wind. So it kind of tries to maintain a consistent speed. Here's a great photo from U.S. Library of Congress. Unclear where this is from, although it sure looks like the High Plains. I don't see any trees out there. Love this photo. One, they've got a windmill in it, but it's like the whole family, and it also showed how important the windmill was. The windmill was part of the family, just like the dog was. You had your horses, you had your house, you had your kids, you had your dog, and then very prominently there is the windmill. Little side note, this was a further adaptation of windmills. This is a vaneless windmill. There's no back vane to it. If you look real close, you can see, I believe that looks like a rooster, a windmill weight. And the wind was actually coming from behind this family towards the house through that windmill. So it's kind of a little bit of the opposite that you might be thinking. And it was either a very windy day that day, or they had the windmill off, given how the panels of the vanes are sitting on that. So the next leap forward on windmill design is the Eclipse windmill. It was designed in 1866. And what was different about this windmill than previous windmills was it had a fixed head on it. So nothing goofy happened with the blades twisting or bending in and out. And if you look real closely at that upper design, you kind of see a spatula-looking thing sticking out. It sticks out at the side. Well, that would capture the wind and then bend the tail such that it would move the entire windmill face out of the wind. So if the wind is coming directly at me, and I'm the windmill, and it was a real windy day, it would start turning the windmill face out of the wind. It would spill the wind that way. And if the wind eased up, it would then turn back into it and capture the wind in full. If it was a really windy day, it would really turn over this way. And so that's how that worked. Fewer mechanical parts, so that made it a more reliant technology. The design came about when Reverend Leonard Wheeler and his son, Reverend Wheeler had broken his arm and his son had broken his leg. So it's amazing these klutzes invented what amounts to a very modern way of how windmills spill their wind. But while they were all banged up, they worked on inventing this type of windmill. And so this is a recreation of them behind their windmills. And if you look real closely, kind of in the middle right, it looks like they also invented some pretty good-looking speakers, maybe a boombox or something. You see those white circles in there? I don't know what that is, but. Now those windmills, the Eclipse windmills were very popular on the XIT ranch, and were one of the big purchasers of those windmills. And so here's what that windmill looked like when it went into production. So in sail, out of sail. Nothing bends in and out on that windmill face. It's all with that side paddle you can see sticking out on the left there. And so again, here's an example of one. This one happens to be made of metal. By 1900, the XIT had 335 of these Eclipse windmills, and referred to as the solid wheel windmills. Then at some point, it's unclear to me who figured this out, but someone realized, well, you didn't need the side panel. All you needed to do was have your windmill face off-center from the tail. So if you look on the left, you can see where the windmill face is. And so if the wind's not blowing very much, the tail's straight out the back, but once the wind really starts blowing, it pushes a little more on one side. It has less support on the right side than the left side, so it starts turning it. And so on really windy days, which I know you get a lot of these up here, if you ever take a close look at the windmill, you'll see the tail's not straight in line with the front of the windmill head. And so it's actually spilling the wind, so it doesn't spin too fast and tears itself apart, or tears apart the pump equipment. So let's talk about metal windmills. And a fellow by the name of Risden put together what's the first metal windmill. So all those slats I've showed you in the windmills were made of wood. They had wood bases. And that was actually pretty handy, because if a bird or lightning struck your windmill, it's pretty easy for a rancher or farmer, put some new wood up there and fix the windmill. But people started experimenting with metal, feeling that it could be more resilient. And so Mr. Risden here developed the first metal windmill in 1872 called the iron turbine. And how many of y'all been to the Wind Power Museum in Lubbock? Yeah, great. And those of you who haven't been, you need to go. I about bawled when I saw they had one of these at the museum. They actually have one of these here. It was a good day. Interestingly enough, I'm sure nobody here, but ranchers and farmers can be pretty conservative about new technology. They don't want to change what they're doing if it's worked in the past just for some newfangled thing. And so somewhat surprisingly, it took a long time for ranchers and farmers to go to using metal windmills. Here's another one of those family photos. This is from Nebraska with their iron turbine. Rather beautiful windmill. And it really wasn't until 1882 that metal windmill heads took off. Now the U.S. Wind Energy and Pump Company, the company that Mr. Burnham formed, was dominating the windmill business at that time. And they saw this new technology, these metal windmill heads coming up. And so they're like, wonder if there's anything to these metal windmill heads. And so they had one of their employees, Thomas Perry, take a look into these metal windmills heads. He goes, why don't you look at this and see if there's anything we gotta be worried about? And so this is kind of the guy you want working on your team, because he went all out. He invented a whirling table, where he had this giant table. He could swing a windmill head around at a controlled rate and then measure how efficiently it turned in response to that. And so he could then put different competitors, manufacturers' windmill heads on that machine, and then to see how efficient they were. And then he went ahead and kind of stuck the metal ones on there as well to see how efficient they were. Well, he didn't stop there. He thought, these metal ones seem to have some promise. And so he started messing with the shape of the windmill head, and wound up at the end of his study, after more than 5,000 trials, developing a metal head windmill. The windmill heads you see today, that was 87 more efficient than the most efficient windmill at the time. So that's pretty good. He almost doubled the efficiency. So you would think, when he got called up to his boss's office to get a report on what he had done, that he would be received as a hero. But it was quite the opposite. They were like, ranchers are never going to go for metal windmill heads. We're not interested. He wound up quitting in disgust and hooked up with an industrialist out of Iowa called Laverne Noyes. And they formed a little company you may have heard of called the Air Motor. And Alfred Noyes, he actually put together the metal support structure for a windmill head, and then using the design from Perry, or for the windmill base, and then using the design from Perry for the windmill head, they started selling air motor windmills. In 1888, they sold 24. Not exactly a rolling start, but by 1892, they were selling 20,000 of these windmills a year. By 1900, they had half the windmill sales in the United States. 1914, more than 75% of windmill sales were metal head windmills. And by 1950, Air Motor as a whole had more than had almost 1 million windmills in service and pretty much wiped everyone off the planet in terms of windmill manufacturers. As you know, Air Motor still exists today. They were built in Batavia, Illinois until 1964 when it moved to Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Manufacturing was then outsourced for a short time to Argentina, and actually if you go to the big trade shows, you'll still see FIASA, I think they're called. They're still making Air Motor style windmills. However, Air Motor came back to the United States in Arkansas from 81 to 86, and in 86 a group of Texans bought Air Motor, where they're building them now out of San Angelo, which is kind of a neat piece of history. So some other improvements that came along the way is, if you go back and look at this picture here and you look real closely, you can see there's open gears. A lot of these photos I've showed you, there's just open gears up there. It's an open gearbox. And so folks that worked with these windmills in the old days would have to go and grease these gears quite frequently. Anybody here remember greasing windmill gears? There we go, got somebody in the back. Said if you were a rancher afraid of heights, this was not a good thing to do. And you know, the hornets love setting up nests up there. I've got a quote from an old boy. He said the following: "I suppose you could call those old wooden Eclipse windmills good looking, but I hated to see one come up," said Vester Belkamp in an oral history. The big wooden wheel was hooked to an iron shaft with open-type bearings that required greasing all the time. More than once, I had to use bacon grease or lard on them when I run out of axle grease. I still feel the urge to cuss them windmills when I see one at a museum. So folks did not like to go out and grease these windmill gears. And so people started thinking about, well, how do we make this easier to do? One approach was you put a can of oil at the very top, and it had big rope that went all the way down the bottom, so you could ride up on your horse, reach out and just give it a tug on that rope, and it would put out a blob of grease, and it would grease the gears. So that made things easier, but still every once in a while somebody had to get up there and fill that can back up with oil. If you were a rancher or a farmer afraid of heights, you might look at this windmill. This was an Air Motor design that the entire windmill head could come down, you could grease the wheels and then put it back up again. But it was ultimately in 1906, kind of inspired by internal combustion engines, Model Ts, and auto transmissions, that someone said, hey, why don't we enclose the gears in a metal box and put oil in there so that they self-oil themselves. And this was called the Wonder windmill. It was developed out of Elgin, Illinois. Which again self-lubricated its parts. So with that, I hope I've shown you kind of a fascinating history of windmills. Maybe next time you drive by one, you won't think about them the same. This is another picture of that Columbian exhibition in 1893 in Chicago. It was probably, 8 years ago. It was after a legislative session, and if you're involved with the legislature during session, you like to blow off some steam afterwards. And so I convinced my wife to go on a windmill tour. She still likes to tell her friends that one year I took her on vacation to Lubbock, which I think is a fine place. But we went on a great tour of windmills where We went out to San Angelo and were actually able to tour the air motor plant. They have a lot of the old equipment there as they're stamping those things out. That was great. Of course, we came up through Snyder and all the turbines that are out there. In Lubbock, I can't say enough great things about the Air Power Museum in Lubbock. It's just remarkable. You can drive out from Lubbock to Littlefield, which has, the way my wife put it, she goes, "Did we just drive an hour out of our way to see a reproduction of what used to be the world's tallest windmill for 2 years?" I'm like, "Yes, honey, isn't it wonderful?" Went up to Spearman. I'm sure probably many of you have been in Spearman. It's a fabulous place. I think they have an Adopt a Windmill program, a beautiful little windmill park up there. Went over across to, through Canadian over to Shattuck, Oklahoma, which also has a wonderful windmill park. Stopped off in Elk City, Oklahoma, which has a little windmill park. And then outside of Granbury, there's a windmill bed and breakfast, so you get to sleep with the windmills. Probably some of y'all sleep with windmills every night, but I live in the middle of Austin. They won't let me put one up. So, hope you learned something about windmills, and I don't know if we have any time for questions or not, but thank you so much for your attention.